Hi, everyone. It's Marcy here with NYNA. So happy to be with you all here today. And I'm really excited about Tim Reiniger here with us today, Ron expert. Tim and I have had a whole conversation before we even are starting this recording. So I'm really excited to talk about what we just talked about because I think it's really important. Tim, thank you so much for joining me today on Columbus Day, even. How are you?
Great. Thank you, Marcy, for having me. It's a pleasure. And I've been a fan of yours for quite a while. You've been really nationally significant in your efforts in promoting Ron, and especially in the key state of New York. So thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you. Now, Tim, I want to go back a minute because you've been involved in almost all of the states' Ron laws going forward, right? Am I correct in saying that? And there are really only a handful of states that don't have Ron. Is it like four or five states now? Is it even that many?
That's correct. So I've been, well, I was involved in writing the Virginia law back in 2011. And that it actually, it started the year before and it failed in its first attempt, 2010. And then I've been involved in just about every other state enactment, one way or another, in one capacity or another, whether it's assisting with the drafting or testifying. And you're right, there are just a few states left, Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina, that have not enacted a Ron law. Now, South Carolina does have an e-notarization law, which is very robust. But so yeah, that Georgia, Mississippi are other key holdouts.
All right, but that's nice to know that the other states have kind of followed suit. And what I love about this is 2011, because you hear people say all the time, well, Run is new, right? It's new. Okay, that's not new. It's 2024. And there's been a lot, maybe in your state it's new, but overall, the concept is not new. It's been here since 2011. Now, would you agree that really adaption kind of was pushed through in the COVID space? Is that really what kind of opened up the other states to, okay, like we see the barriers here to not allowing Ron, especially when everything was shut down. Hopefully that never happens again. But is COVID really the catalyst that kind of propelled this technology, do you think?
Yes, it seems to be the case. That's well, first of all, Marcia, remind everyone that the concept of electronic notarization of documents, that is, notaries signing, electronically sealing electronic documents, goes back to the e-sign law, 2001. So that's, over 20 years ago now, just for that. And then the RON, online notarization process, came in, as you just noted, 10 years later. So none of it is really new. But yeah, there's been, because of half of all notarizations involving real property, the years, well, all the years of electronic notarization and then Ron have run into the issues of educating the uh, the mortgage industry, land title industry, and then the land recording officials as to how this can be done. And then beyond that, the technology to be used and the integration issues. And it's like anything, you got different players want to be the ones to dominate the space and have theirs be the standard, whether it's the best or not, and so forth. So we've been victimized by all that. And then ultimately, to your point, the legal practitioners from the beginning with Ron have had to get their heads around the personal jurisdiction issues, which, of course, as you know, for centuries, notarization say involved physical appearance, and the idea of just through a law to say physical appearance is satisfied by an online technology communications appearance has, I think, still left some lawyers not quite believing it, or it just seems like a stretch or whatever. They're just too traditional, especially the older lawyers. But as you say, the COVID period really broke down those barriers, and overnight, especially with the wills and trusts community, with the needs of, I'm sure you saw it in New York, healthcare workers, others wanting to update their wills or write wills and so forth. And they needed two witnesses. And of course, very few states actually allow an electronic will. That's another subject, but that's growing. There's greater interest in that. And so many of the governors issued executive orders, including in New York, that would allow for the witnessing of wills, trust documents, and their amendments, the witnessing to be done via communication technology. Now, the actual documents themselves still had to be wet signed. So it resulted in these executive orders, which, from the Ron perspective, were kind of kludgy and odd, but they served a real purpose. And it was great because it got people, practitioners, signers used to why not use the online process like we're doing right now. It's convenient. You don't have to drive into New York City and so forth. So, so that was great. And so then after that, many other states were open to outright enacting a RON authorization across the board. And so you're right, now we're up to 47 states or so, and including New York State, which has been great. So, but we can get into this, but that's opened up other issues. One of the biggest being how do we identify the signers online? And that has resulted in state by state variations, complexities. And New York currently is somewhat more tied to national, federal identity proofing standards, the organization called NIST, which is the Department of Commerce. But and from the beginning with Virginia, by the way, the legislators, when I was going around talking to them, that was their first question. What is going to be a standard for identity proofing that will be such that these documents will be accepted by other states? And they said they thought it'd be better to be tied to a federal standard instead of the Commonwealth of Virginia making up an identity proofing standard. So at that time, I had been working with individuals in Washington on this, and they had a process called antecedent in-person proofing, which was the only really applicable similar policy from NIST and the federal government. So that's why Virginia cited that. And that was amusing to me, was it was not ever used in the land title industry and so forth. So there were endless meetings with their lawyers to try to figure out what this mean and how it would be deployed, endless confusion. But the identity proofing over time has been more and more simplified, and the Uniform Law Commission, which I was also involved with, it drafted revised Uniform Law and Material Acts, simplified, tried to standardize the laws, and 30 states or so have that, and it just requires two forms of identity proofing that can be specified in the state. So that has largely been solved, and of course, identity proofing, authenticating signage in general is a technology that's changing across the board all the time. So it's good to have the notary laws flexible enough to be able to leverage all those, including biometrics, which has been, still is a bit controversial in some quarters, but that can be a useful option for notaries and signers using RON.
Yeah, I think, you make a good point, and I always tell notaries when we talk about the importance of notarization, I always say, how many emergency orders during COVID like so affected one demographic or one occupation, right? I mean, almost every state had an emergency notarization law. That's something that's significant. We should really take into play. As for the mortgage industry, they're slow to progress most of the time anyway, right? Like, we are not a progressive industry overall. But let's talk about in general, adoption of RON across all sorts of demographics and occupations and receivers out there. I feel like it's slower than we thought it was going to be. Why do you think that might be? Like, what do you think the barriers are to more people accepting documents that are, notarized remotely?
Well, I think there's still a lot of confusion uh, in the marketplace with even lawyers. It's still I'm here in Maine, and I just was in meetings of two of the leading law firms in Maine on other related subjects, but this came up and I was curious, and they still had never used it. It was still so new to them, they didn't understand still how it would work.
Do you think that
And their
that's a big
notaries.
part of it? Like, they don't know what to use it for? I think that, at least for me, we talked about this before. I don't think that I think that they need specific examples. So I tell notaries when they're marketing, you need to give specific examples as to when it would be useful, like we talked about. The majority of my run is for individuals who are not in the country and who can't get to the embassy or consulate. And that's a great example that we give to the attorneys here is, hey, if you got someone who can't get to the consulate and it's going to hold up their closing or their estate matter or their divorce, right? Like, this is a great opportunity. Do you think that they just need very specific examples? Because I think that I don't want to say they can't think outside of the box, but they're really, in their mind, I feel like, think, well, this is how we've always done it. That's my favorite. We've always done it this way, Marcy. Why change? And I'm like, well, wouldn't it be nice to do it like in a different way where it's easier and not as time consuming or expensive? I mean, sometimes people have to travel hours and hours to get to an embassy or consulate, right? They have to fly or take time off from work. Like, why are we still doing this in 2024?
Yeah, so I suspect for the lawyers and law firms, maybe there's still a fear of, yeah, they need to know that it absolutely is going to be accepted and recognized at some point, by some government office or court. And maybe they're just still not completely confident about that. And that's kind of, I think, one of the problems with the federal bill discussions. It keeps throwing doubts about interstate recognition out there. Anyone, the advocates are saying it's needed for interstate recognition, and the rest of us have realized that the 50-state statutory regime has in it interstate recognition already, and that was the whole driving point of the Uniform Law Commission acts going back to 1892. But this doesn't help to have this doubts being raised. There also is legitimate confusion over what kind of documents can even be signed electronically. So just because you have a RON law doesn't mean every document can be signed by the principal electronically or by the notary. For example, wills, as you mentioned, some of the related documents there, and or like healthcare powers of attorney. Some of the states grappling with that.
Sure.
So, at any rate, so there were those issues, and then you mentioned the foreign signers, and I personally in Virginia, after the law passed, became an electronic notary, so I could experience it. And the requests I got were typically someone in a foreign country, just as you talked about, in the case of a woman in Beirut whose relatives were passing in a state situation in Northern Virginia. Her brothers were in Northern Virginia, with the father who just passed away or so forth, and she was in Beirut. They needed to get her signature. And at that time, even though it was dangerous to go outside because of the war situation going on 10 years ago. So anyway, it was great. So I formed the Material Act for her. But there is still confusion there. But anyone can sign, any foreign signer here before U.S. notary, Ron, documents are to be used in the United States. And happens all the time. You actually made a great point, Marcy, and I remind people when they approach this subject, start with how the paper world works. So if a citizen from Lebanon can appear before you in New York, uh, and there's no problem there, it's an in-person paper Material Act, but it's the same thing with the That's the beauty of the run, how it extends the jurisdiction.
Mhm.
Now, what we can't do is a notarial act for her to be used in Lebanon. In that
Correct.
case, you know
Mhm.
that's just so we need to get people to understand that issue. And you know, in the Americans, I actually so I had an American needed a signature for a document that was on a cruise, and you know usually the issue is connectivity. Frankly, you probably discovered that. To me, connectivity is the biggest challenge of Ron. You know, getting them done and rely.
100%, especially in a foreign
Yes.
country. I just did one for a couple. Yes, I just did a couple who were on a cruise ship in Greece as well. And it is, I think, the number one barrier for that piece of it is making sure that where they are, they have a great stable connection. We are very spoiled here in the U.S., where for the most part, if we're not rural, we have a great connection, but that's not the case in most other countries. So I just wanted to jump in and say I totally feel that pain. I, I felt that.
And then I had another signer, an American citizen in living in France, was selling his condo. He and his wife were selling a condo in Alexandria, Virginia. And when we were doing the schedule to perform the run, the municipality was had shut down the internet service for a day or so to
Yeah.
rewire whatever they're doing. It was or was about to, so we had to race to get it done or fit it in. That was the most stressful part. So, but yeah, I think there's still confusion out here. I mean, as a barrier, but the other barrier, MRC, is the technology. So you have industries, probably with the whole e-mortgage space, they're trying to sort out who's controls the technology, who dictates
Hmm.
the standards and so forth. They don't want to have to deal with notaries in New York having all different types of platforms and technology that may not be up to the right technology security standards or just
Sure.
integrate. So then, as notaries, and this is another subject I'm sure you've dealt with many times, you're probably faced with some title companies only want you to use their platform.
Or
So
a specific platform, right? They have a list. We see this a lot now is, title companies have an approved list. Some states have approved lists of providers. New York, we don't have an approved list. So I'm small government. I like that we don't necessarily have an approved list, but I will say that there are challenges that as well as determining the notary is not responsible for determining if the technology meets the standards of New York state law, right? And we are not, I mean, most of us are not technology people. So that can be a little complicated and I think that that's the challenge here in New York was that, when we came to the biometrics piece of it, people were like, well, it's not allowed, it's allowed. Well, because you had to actually do some researching to that NIST standard to see if it actually fit. So I'm in agreement with you. Plus, it's not, people don't understand this, but it's not cheap as a notary to be on a RON platform, right? There are costs associated with what we have to pay. And when you have an approved list or you only allow notaries to use certain technologies, then it kind of pigeonholes that notary is to will they be profitable? And while yes, notarization is not just about running a business per se, for some of us it is our livelihood. So we do need to be profitable in that space also.
yeah, so those are you know tough for the notaries, and they have to learn these different platforms and pay the licensing fees potentially.
Mhm.
So that's been a barrier. Now, some other barriers from a national perspective, so not so much New York, but some of the states really want to have a lot of regulation
Mhm.
around it. And, from the perspective of they want to protect consumers. And so they feel they need to, they look at the notaries as, they're public officers. So therefore, the Secretary of State in the given state feels that they have to put more guardrails around it, and which results in especially also for the providers. So it make the technology providers makes it more expensive. You have to
Sure.
do filings, more fees, and to the state and all that. So ultimately, those expenses get passed down to the notaries. And then, at a high level, before the call, we were talking about the need for apostilles. It sounds it's a like a fancy subject, international documents, but there are a lot of state situations with properties abroad or people abroad, properties being probated in New York. So I've worked with lawyers from estate planning organizations across the United States, plus others that have need for documents going abroad. And they've been wondering, why do we not have electronic apostilles? And so The Hague has been working on this. I've been working with them since
Yeah,
five. There are solutions for this. Montana, to its credit, has aggressive,
Lori, yes,
yes,
yeah, they've been a huge proponent, very aggressive in
very
doing
aggressive
this. Yes,
him, and now they've got Kentucky coming close. I think Utah and other states. But Lori at national conferences, Secretary of State said she will sit down with anyone from any state to show how easy it is how
mhm,
to do it. Uh, and so, by the way, the American Bar Association actually passed a resolution a year or so ago at their national meeting to urge states to integrate electronic apostilles.
yeah,
Even after that, it's still not regarded as a priority in many offices and so forth. But so the hope would be New York, the secretary's office would embrace doing this, and it'd be invaluable for you all in New York. The use case is great.
sure.
And
With all of the banking and international, business that occurs in New York, it just seems like this would be one of the first places to adopt. It's interesting to me when it comes to technology that there's so many things that make everyone's life easier that we just don't move forward with that in a manner to do so, right? I know we just talked about, the safety of the consumer and the guardrails, but what I love about Ron, is the recording. Like I just can't get past the idea of like this whole interaction between myself and the consumer is recorded. And 10 years down the road, you can still take a look at it. When you're in person, it's a he said, she said conversation. Did I issue the oath? Did they respond affirmatively to that oath? Did I ask the right questions? Did they seem like they were aware of what they're signing? That recording protects everyone involved. Like it is a great thing to have. I say the same thing when it comes to estate documents. I know there are attorneys who are like, well, we don't really want all of that recorded. But I'm like, but why wouldn't you? It only helps your cause, right? Especially if there's a claim down the road of fraud or manipulation or duress or competency. It's all there now, right? It only aids you in what you're going to do. I'm always a little surprised people don't think like that, but maybe, that's just like that. Maybe that's the other side of the shoe where they're like, well, we don't want, we don't want any evidence or proof of that. I don't know. I would think that Ron in of itself does protect the consumer in a way that in person just hasn't in the past. Would you agree with that?
absolutely, the going back to the Virginia experience, lobbying for the first time, you think about it, the Virginia legislators had no model. They knew that no one else, no other state in the country had done it.
Hmm.
And to their credit, they're really willing to embrace it, obviously. But that was the other question or comment that would come up. They would ask about, how we're going to do the authentication of the signers remotely. But they would all say they could get the fact that this is going to be better than the paper process because of the just what you said, Marcy. They got it that having that recording would A, deter fraudsters, would not want to get on tape, and B, would be better evidence in the event of a dispute than the memory of the notary, if the notary was even still alive or could be found, and all that. So, which does get to another big issue as to the storage of the recordings and who controls that and how to access that. And I do think that the states have struggled with that, and again, like everything else, it's not uniform. And that how to go about getting access to these recordings, as of course more and more the trial attorneys find out about this, they definitely want to get access. And also, I've experienced some of the large in the e-mortgage space companies want to get their hands on the recordings. They want to have them, but that gets into the issues of, well, the notary is the public officer who really has the legal control over these, and can it be done legally, lawfully for the notary to hand over the recordings to some bank or title company? So those are interesting legal issues. I don't know if you see that come up much, and as you work at different
We
platforms. And
have we have seen some mortgage companies who have asked, like, we need the executed documents and we want, a copy of the recording. And I think that that is a little bit of, you said, look at the legal thing, and a little bit of your state. Like, what does your state say? Does your state allow that to even happen? Are there rules in your states around that? I mean, I think that that's an important piece of the puzzle here. And like I said, I'm fine. I'm not a proponent of that large federal legislation. I think, I wrote a letter for you to submit because it seems simply not necessary when there are only 3 states that don't allow for rent. Like, what's the point at this point, right? Like, it seems like that just seems not right. But the point I'm making here is that that is a little bit of, I think, some of the confusion, right, for notaries out here is that it just varies upon, mortgage company here, a title company there, attorney company here. Like, what do they all want? They all have different rules and requirements, and that really depends on what your state allows. And I think that as notaries, we need to be very vocal about, hey, I can't do that. I'm really sorry. That's against the law in my state, right? It's not allowed here. I think sometimes I would say notaries get in trouble because they're helpers. We want to help. I want to help everybody who comes to me, but sometimes helping them isn't in their best interest, or quite frankly, in the interest of what I need to accomplish either. So I think the mortgage industry should probably come to some sort of, a kumbaya moment and be like, okay, here's what we should, do across the space. But I think, because I talked about before we got on this call, the mortgage industry is super slow to adapt, right? And I will say, when it comes to, we were talking about before too, like the whole idea of what's an original document, right? I'll have people who will say to me, hey, are you going to overnight me the originals? And I'll say, those are the originals that I emailed you, right? That's the original. They're electronically signed, electronically notarized. That is considered an original signature. That's what you should be using. Not everybody still understands that or can wrap their brain around it. And I will say, here in New York, it took a long time for us to be able to electronically record documents, right? We have some very rural areas. And that, I think, was a little bit of a barrier too. Not that you can't walk in those paper documents, but again, that seems, I don't know, doesn't make a lot of sense, right? If you're going to electronically sign and notarize, you should be able to electronically record as well. It doesn't make any sense to print them off and walk them in, but I see why you probably have to. I think the technology in some states or counties, right, in those levels, just hasn't been to the same standard as maybe the run technology. Was that a barrier? Do you feel like at one point as well?
yeah, so you mentioned the federal bill, which is still alive. There is a formal attempt now to have it added to the National Defense Authorization Act. This has been done before, and committee staff, the Armed Services Committee, has found it to be not germane, but it's a legislative tactic. And you're right, for those of us who have been in this industry, in the state by state fight, know that notaries are state authorized officers. There's been the concern about having a federal involvement, and why have a federal bill. Maybe when it first started, when there were like 12 states that had a Ron bill during the COVID period. So the question is, why this continued push? Well, it's really the Mortgage Banker Association has been largely driving and funding this with an alliance with the American Land Title Association and some other tech companies that think they're allied such they would all benefit. It's really two things. A would be the banking industry leveraging a federal bill to basically create and impose a national standard, including a technology standard, so that they don't have to deal with 50 state variations. So That's part of it. And then number two, that doesn't get as much attention. The law would basically mandate that all of the state and local officials accept fraud. So Connecticut is brought up frequently by the federal bill advocates. Any state throws up barriers to recording of Ron documents, so they feel that the federal bill would override that, and again, help them achieve a uniform national capability for doing electronic deeds, electronic mortgages with Ron. So it's not necessarily said at all that way so bluntly, but that's really the reason why they'd be putting so much money and some lobbying time to push for this, when to the rest of us, like, what's the point that almost every state already has Ron authorization?
And it's
So
put a lot of time and money into their approval process, whatever they've done, right? We don't want to affect those states, the majority of them, who have already implemented some sort of Ron law and are happy with what they've implemented, right? Some of these states have taken, years and years and years to come to this conclusion and adopt these laws. So it seems like the federal bill is, if you probably everyone out there listening, I'm not a proponent, neither is Tim. We're really not for this. This
oh,
I feel
and
like it hurts us more than helps us, right? Really in the long run.
that's been my feeling. It's it continues this issue of raising doubt about interstate recognition, which should have been put to bed already. But get lawyers like off this get these banking groups still thinking we need this federal bill on interstate recognition. There must be a problem. It's like, no, there isn't. They're driving it for other reasons, so they can to address creating national standards for technology and so forth. Um, so it's frustrating. And then the other thing is, I know that Senate Judiciary Committee staff know that there are other really grand legal issues, constitutional issues, that I think a lot of people just over the subject of notaries don't necessarily want to have to get into and spend all kinds of time and so forth. But notaries are state officers. And the idea of a federal bill like this coming in, uh, overriding the states in how they set requirements for their state public officers, would be a grand constitutional case to go to the Supreme Court if anyone wanted to put the time and money into it. So it's why do we need that? Just create another barrier. Sets of fighting over. There got to be a bunch of states right off the bat would push back and say to banks that are citing if the federal law is saying, oh no, these are our state public officers, we call the shots on what identity proofing they're going to use or technology. So you have these conflicts, basically.
So for anybody listening, I certainly don't want to sway you one way or the other, but I think it's important, if you didn't know there was a federal law out there, that you do your due diligence and do some research and really take the time to take a look to see what it says, what it looks like, how it might affect you, right? I think that as notaries, I always say, advocacy over apathy. I know sometimes we feel like, well, we don't have any say, no one cares what we think about, right? Like, it's really hard in a lot of states to get any sort of really great notarial law passed. I think that that's really because we don't make ourselves heard, right? We're not involved. And and this is one of those cases where it would affect you, it would affect the job that you do, it would affect how you handle notarization. So whether you're pro or con here, either side is okay for me as long as you take a side and take a stand. So do a little research. So Tim, where do you see us going with Ron here in the future? Like, do you think we're going to see more adoption in other industries? Now, I know I'm going to veer for a minute. I know there's been a lot of conversation about fraud lately, right? And I always say it doesn't, there's always going to be a criminal out there who figures out how to manipulate the system. No matter how good it is, there's always someone out there who uses their powers not for good. And I think that we're seeing a little bit of fraud coming into play here in Ron, right? Especially with sellers who aren't coming to closing, and there's a little manipulation. There's a conversation around AI and how is that going to affect, the individual? Like, is there going to be a holographic image of a person? Can we really tell if it's them? Do you think that fraud in how we're seeing it now is going to hinder Ron, or do you think that that's really going to be just like, fraud and in person? Like there's always a fraud element to anything that we do. How will that affect Ron going forward, do you think?
I think it just raises the importance of the notaries.
Hmm.
And so, I know in my work in information security as a lawyer, the security gurus in the field will say that the key to security is the people. That's where the breakdowns occur, and that's where the strongest protections are. So it gets back to having well-trained, ethical notaries. And this has been the case in the paper world. How many notaries we've been hearing would not enforce personal appearance, and so, and it was to the point where I've come across articles written by leading law professors. I forget what year, 1920s, whatever, talking about the real scourge problem of notaries not enforcing in-person proofing and being a leading cause of not catching forgery.
And that does seem to
Really,
be a reoccurring thread a lot of times when you're reading these cases or you see on the news. Like that seems silly, the easiest of all things, but that does seem to be. And I don't think that some of the notaries who are doing it out of. I like to always come back and say, I don't think they're all, fraudulent or criminal. I think sometimes it's, hey, my boss hands me a piece of paper. And I'm not agreeing to this. I'm just saying I see sometimes, right? I mean, it's been the case in my career. People have been like, hey, well, so and so signed this. Can you notarize it when you're at work or whatever? Not that I've ever done that, but people seem to think it's not as important as it really is, right? They don't really understand the work of a notary. I think sometimes they just think it's, hey, stamp and sign and it's notarized, we're moving on. But that's not really all we do here, right? It's beyond the stamp and sign.
the having confidence in the land record system, property, depends critically on the quality of the notaries, the notarizations and process. And getting back to your point about, we've been hearing about deep fakes. And surely, most of us are easily tricked by a deep fake, you know, uh, a face imposed on another body and all that stuff. I think it's well done, but we can use technology to detect the deep fakes. So what the Iran platforms will need to build that in. And, and the notaries need to have some basic alertness. The alarm bell should go off when there's some weird scenario,
It
some,
still comes back to the notary, right? We shouldn't be completely reliant on the technology that we're using. It's a wonderful assist to us, right? It's great that it's helping us verify that
right,
driver's license, that passport, because Lord knows, I wouldn't know if someone came to me with, a passport from Mexico, or I can assume that it's, and look at it and think it's legitimate, but that process helps. But there's still that verification on my side. Are they acting like, they're wanting to sign? Do they seem like that they're aware of what they're signing? Are they looking side to side to see if there's someone else in the room? All of those things are still the same things, body language wise, that we look at it in person. We should be doing electronically, right? None of that has changed for us.
right. Yeah. Just like, I've seen some tapes of notarizations when there's a little dispute going on and so forth. And, I know I'm laughing because, I've heard of this stuff. That's a possibility. And you see it in action, but, have, uh, a granny sitting there and the basic question, like, okay, is this, is this, you're here to sign a deed or something. And granny's like looking for an answer from somebody.
Hmm. Yeah.
If the notary isn't like, who else is there? Who are you talking to? What's going on? Then the notary is doing a terrible disservice. Yeah, so the
Well,
notaries
there's
have to
some
be
best practice, right?
right,
So even if your state doesn't lay out a script, or there should be, just like in person, there should be some best practices that all notaries follow, whether remote or in person, to verify some of this information, right? And I think, it's important to remember too, your state allows you to say no, because and I think every state allows you to say no if there's any sort of indication of fraud or duress. You have and you should ethically say, I'm so sorry, but I just can't complete this notarization. I just, right, for whatever reason, and kind of go from there.
And that raises the point. If you were to ask me what is the biggest weakness, not just of Ron, but of all notarization laws, and for the life of me, I don't know why this hasn't been addressed. I wish I made it forward. When a notary suspects a problem and won't go forward, how to put teeth into that evidence versus saying, I won't go forward, okay, and then the person just calls another notary. There needs to be some way to scare the fraudsters into knowing that, if we try this and the notary
Yeah.
refuses to go forward, it's got to be reported to the police. I mean, I don't know what, but there needs to be some way. And the same with the paper world. And I think notaries could say that this person, I guess, if they had a journal requirement, the notary could say, well, the person was inebriated or under the influence, didn't have the level of awareness, understanding. Okay, but without a journal, there would be no record of the person tried once or twice, or
Mhm.
whatever. Or there was a concern of someone trying to influence granny. So
Also, a best practice, if your state doesn't allow, it doesn't require you, I should say, to keep a journal. All states allow you to. You should 100% keep a journal, people. I cannot remember what I had for breakfast yesterday. There's no way, if you do this even part time and you're doing hundreds of notarizations a year, I don't know how you would remember unless something really stood out to you in that particular notarization, like something, I did a notarization once for Santa Claus. So I will always remember that notarization because it was Santa Claus. But the majority of my notarizations I would never remember. And I suspect that for a fraudulent notarization, it'd probably be as down key as possible, right? They're not going to make any waves. They don't want you to remember that notarization. So that's my PSA for today. Journals, people, keep journals.
yes, journals are absolutely paper world and electronic. The rest of our lifetimes, that will be the case.
Yes. And the whole piece about, notaries having a little more authority in what they can do. This is the hot topic between me and Professor Michael Closen, who is one of my favorite people in the notary world. He is on board that same train too. Like, notaries should have a little more authority in what they can do and not do when they're the ones who are on the hook. Although we would hope that if that ever came, to court, it would be easy to say, hey, I didn't do it because I really was concerned about, competency or fraud or whatever. And the court would say, hey, great, you were doing what you're supposed to be doing. Notaries are the first line of defense in that fraud piece. So
I just
to
want to
wrap
say
up,
I've
yeah,
enjoyed Michael Clausen, um, the first law professor, really, to get into the whole notary field. He's been passionate about notaries, and I fully agree with his point. And what you just mentioned is in notaries being such professionals, and they're not just TSA agents checking
hmm
IDs. I mean, they're checking witnesses to the mental awareness and understanding, which is these hugely complex issues and duress and all. So, but I think there's a tendency to think that notaries are ID checkers like TSA, and
100% stamp and sign, right? What does the notary do? You just stamp and sign. I'm like, I do a lot more than just stamp and sign. Although, yes, I know that's the only piece that you see, but I think to go back to the very first point, education. We don't educate the public as to the importance of what notaries are and what they do. That was a big piece for us. Is notaries are there for every important thing in your life. When you buy a house, when you adopt a child, when you start your own business, right? Key, huge moments in time, we're there for you. And I think that when you don't really think about notaries because you don't really need them till you need them, right? And then you're like, I have to run out and find a notary. But we really do or are involved in all of these big things. And Ron, well, should be a big thing, right? It is so critical to remind people the reasoning for why these laws passed. We're here to try to make things easier for you and better, right? We talked about the, the apostille part, but even, for me, if you're stuck in a place, and there was, I did some runs for some attorneys who were vacationing. Well, I wouldn't say vacation, but they were in Israel. And, during the conflict when it first started, and there was no open embassy for them to get to. There was no consulate. And they needed documentation notarized for their cases that were being handled here in New York. And I thought to myself, those cases would have been on hold. They wouldn't have been able to do anything if we didn't have Ron. So I think it's important to look at it that way as well, right? Like, we're allowing the world to still turn when other things are happening because of this technology piece. Tim, I always like talking to you. We could talk for hours and hours and hours, and I so appreciate you.
Yeah,
Is there
what a great example.
anything that you want to say on an ending note here to wrap up our conversation?
Yeah, that's a great example, Marcy. This is a wonderful tool. It, simply put, Ron is an extension of the kind of the magistry and the importance of the notarial office as a public officer. It's nothing new. It's not a different notary. It's an extension of the notary's powers, and I think it makes notaries more important than ever in
Hmm.
our time of cyber space and
Yeah.
economics.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for talking to me. I really appreciate it. Thank you for everybody who listened. I know I'm always like, it's like 20 or 30 minutes, but Tim and I always have a lot to say. We're both chatty. So I
Ah,
appreciate everyone's time today. I hope this was helpful. Thank you so much, Tim. I appreciate you.
thank you,
We'll be
Marcy.
sure to have you back again.
I'll be delighted to.
Take care.
Okay. Have a great day.